everyone, welcome to Senior Watercolor Hour. Today we're going to be doing a watercolor mushroom. If you registered, you should have everything that you need in your kit. All you'll need to grab is a pencil to do the tracing of the line drawing. Let's get started. So I'm going to go over everything that you have in your kit. You should have a copy of this so you know what the final project looks like. You should also have a couple of example photos. These were downloaded from Pixabay, and this is what we're using for our inspiration. You should have 5 watercolors on one of these cards, a sheet of watercolor paper. You should also have some of this. This is masking fluid, so we've put it in small containers for you, but this is what it looks like if you were to go buy it. I will warn you, this does have latex, so if you have a latex allergy, don't use this. We've included a question in the registration about that. You should also have a size 6 watercolor brush and one of these embossing tools, and this is what we're going to use to apply the masking fluid later on. You'll want to have a pencil handy for doing your tracing, and you're also going to want to have an eraser for removing the masking fluid. First thing you'll need to do is get your tracing done. So this is a pretty simple one without a lot of detail. I use a light box, but you can do this using a window. Just hold up the outline to a sunny window and place your watercolor paper on top and trace it that way. Next, we're going to go over the colors that we're using. So you should have a scrap in your kit to see what the colors look like. So here's our permanent red deep. It's kind of an orangey red. Here's our Madder Lake. That's a cooler red. And then we have Azo Yellow. Burnt Umber. And Sap Green. So these are the shades we'll be using. This painting will take a while to complete because we're going to be working with a couple of different layers, and we're also going to be using masking fluid, which takes some time to dry. So the first step for this is to get our spots drawn in. So just make sure that you make them different sizes and place them all over the place, including along the edge. You can use the reference photos in your kit to kind of see what this looks like. So the masking fluid will ensure that the paper doesn't get any paint on it. So once we apply our masking fluid, we'll paint over that, and then later on we'll use an eraser to remove the masking fluid, which will leave you with white. And then we will add some details to those spots. So I'm just going to start by drawing in some little spots. And they don't need to be perfect circles. So this reference photo has a ton of spots in all sorts of shapes and sizes. With this one, they're a little bit more uniform, so I'm going by this one as I'm drawing. So you don't have as many of the really tiny spots. And I'm moving my pencil around. When I concentrate on one area, I tend to make the spots a little too uniform, so I think it helps to kind of move around the page. So I'm going to remove some of these. So you can just adjust it until you get something that you like. Okay, so now we're going to use our masking fluid, and you have this in a small container. You may need to shake it up. When it's in there, it kind of separates. I will warn you, this stuff smells pretty horrible. It's just a weird kind of strong smell. So if scents bother you, you may want to do this in an area that has some good ventilation. Okay, so we're going to be using this tool. It's just a way to get the masking fluid to the paper without picking up too much of the stuff. So you can use either end. I think you all have different sizes, but you know, you can use the bigger one for the bigger spots, the smaller one for the smaller spots, just whatever you are comfortable with. If you need to test it out, you can use this scrap. If you haven't used it before, it can be a little funny to work with, so it gets kind of bubbly when you shake it. So you'll just have a little bit on there, and you'll apply it to your paper like this, and just keep applying every time you have a new spot. So once you get used to it, you can start adding it to your paper. You don't have to fill in the spaces that you drew perfectly. We are going to be covering this with some pretty dark paint, and then we are going to be going over the spots with an eraser, so if there are any stray pencil marks, those will get picked up later on. You don't want the masking fluid to be on in a super thick layer. So just keep filling this space in until you've got all the spots filled. Okay, so once you're done with that, you can wipe this off, and you want to let this air dry. So sometimes I use a blow dryer to dry things off more quickly, but if you use a blow dryer with masking fluid, the masking fluid will heat up and stick to the paper, and you won't be able to get it off later on. So definitely just let this air dry, and then we'll come back and start painting this in. So now that our masking fluid is dry, and you'll notice even when it's dry, it's still a little bit tacky. That's okay. What you want is to not pick any up when you're touching it. So we're looking at our reference photo, and we're going to start with the cap. We're going to be using Permanent Red Deep, Madder Lake, and the Azo Yellow. So the first thing I'm going to do is just get this whole thing wet, because we're going to be using a wet on wet technique. We want all of the colors that we're using to just kind of blend together. And the water shouldn't disturb the masking fluid at all. If it does, you'll need to let it dry for a little bit longer. So once you've got all of this filled in with water, we're going to start with our colors. As you can see, this is all not just one red shade. You've got yellow in here, as well as over here. You've got some of the sort of orangey red, which we'll be using Permanent Red Deep for that. And then you've got this other red shade that's more like the Madder Lake. So it's just going to be a mixture of all of that. So I'm going to start with my Permanent Red Deep. And just start adding it in different spots. So you want it to be pretty dark, so you don't want a ton of water on your brush. You want it to be mostly paint, especially since this paper is already wet, so that's going to dilute the color a little bit. Now I'm going to add in some of the Madder Lake. And it is pretty dark along the bottom here, so I'm going to use that Madder Lake along the edge. Now over here on this side, it's pretty light. There's some yellow, so we're going to add in some of the azo yellow in here. And we'll put some over here. This is the Madder Lake. And we are going to add another layer of paint. So I'm just going to drop in some more of the permanent red. You don't want to work at this too long because your paint will start to dry. And then you'll have streaks of color that aren't blended. So I'm going to stop messing with this for now, and we'll do another layer of paint a little bit later. Because we don't want this section here to end up red, I'm going to leave that alone for now and work on this instead. So there's not a lot of color in that section. It's mostly going to be water with some of the burnt umber mixed in. So I'm just cleaning off my brush and my hand because I got paint all over my hand. Okay. So let me grab my finished painting. So as you can see, this is not very dark. It's just a little bit of brown, a little bit of the red. You can barely tell it's in there, but there's a little bit of red and then the brown spots. So I'm going to get it wet. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is grab some of the burnt umber. And if you've got a palette, it will be helpful. I didn't grab one, but you just want it to be pretty watered down. So you want a lot of water on your brush and just a little bit of paint. I'm just going to test it. Okay, so that's a good consistency. You just want it very light brown. And I'm going to drop it up here along the edge. And I'm going to run it over here. And then I'm just going to drop random spots. And then I'm going to get some of the Madder Lake, and I'm going to water it down and add some of that in here too. So I've got my brush dried off, And I'm going to grab some more of the Burnt Umber, but this time it's going to be pretty dark. So more paint, less water. And I'm going to come back and just make a couple of spots darker while this is still wet. Okay, so we're going to start working on the grass down here. This is still a little bit wet, but as long as we don't flood this area with paint and water, we should be fine. So we're going to be using some watered down sap green. So you want it pretty light. And we're just going to be adding this color down here. It doesn't have to be perfect. And as long as you don't have a ton of water, you should be okay for this area to touch, because we're going to cover it with darker green later on. So if there's a little bit of green blended into that part of the mushroom, it's fine. And I'm going to blend in some burnt umber. I'm just dropping it in random spots. I'll do the same thing with the yellow. Then I'm going to grab some of the green. Whoops, I just got some paint on my paper. I'll clean that up in a second. And add some blades of grass. So this is still wet. And I'm just going to pull some of this paint up. Remember, the grass goes in all different directions, so you don't want to just add your strokes all going one way. I'm going to do the same thing with some of the burnt umber, and this is watered down. So just add some light brown. And we'll come back to this in a second. So we're going to start working on this. As long as this is dry, it looks like it's almost there. So I will just give that a minute and then we'll start working on this. So now that this is dry, we're going to be working on this here. So if you look at the photo, I've cut off a good portion of this just because you couldn't really see it anyway. It's not really going to add anything to the painting, so I've cut it off around here. But you can see that there's some yellow along the bottom. I've also got marker here because I traced it and I needed to see this part a little bit better. You wouldn't have this blue mark here. So we're going to use the azo yellow. We're going to be using just the tip of the brush for this, so you don't have to soak the whole brush in paint, because we're just going to be adding it to these corners. So for the rest of this, I'm going to be using mostly water, but there's just a little bit of burnt umber on this. So I'm filling all this in, and then when I get to the bottom here, it'll touch that yellow part and just kind of blend out. I'm going to add just a little bit more burnt umber under here. Okay, so while this is drying, we can't work on this, otherwise this will get flooded with red. So we're going to go back to the bottom here and make this darker. So I'm going to do the same thing, just get this wet. And then we're going to be using sap green, but it's going to be darker than the last time. So I'm just going to drop this in. So you don't want it all to be the same shade of green. So some areas are darker, some are lighter. I'm also going to add some burnt umber in there. Some more green. Now what I'm going to do is drag some of this paint out to make more of these blades of grass. So you can just dip your brush in and pull some of that paint out. And now I'm going to grab some of the sap green, and again you want this to be pretty dark, and I'm going to add some more blades in. So you want there to be a mix of lighter and darker grass. And you can just blend the bottom of that. And I'm also going to add some of the burnt umber. And again, just blend this. Just adding a little bit more green. Okay, so this is pretty much done. Now I'm just waiting for this to dry, and then we're going to add another layer of red and yellow on top. So this is the last part of our painting, and we're going to be painting another layer of the Permanent Red Deep, Madder Lake, and Azo Yellow Medium. So this time I want it to be a bit darker, so I'm not going to add a layer of water first. I'm just going to start with my paint. And we want to make sure that when we're painting a section, and we're using another color, we want to come pretty quickly to blend it out, and we want to use plenty of water. So you don't want any of the edges to get dry. So don't do a huge section because inevitably some of the edges will dry off and then you'll have to try and blend them out. So I'm going to start with the permanent red. And then I'm going to come in, oops, grab too much paint with my Madder Lake. Some more of the permanent red. And if you're not comfortable doing this, you can do what we did earlier and just use the water first and then add your paint, so you'll be sure that it doesn't dry off completely. But with that, it may not end up as dark as you need it, so you might have to do a third layer of paint. So we add some yellow in over here. And over here. I'm adding water here just so my edges don't dry off while I come up here. Some Madder Lake, some permanent red, oops. I got my hand dirty again. Add some Madder Lake down here. Some of the yellow. Just mix it around. And some permanent red. Okay, so now we're going to allow this to dry. And then we'll come back in and color in some of these spots after we remove the masking fluid. So now that the paper is dry, we can remove the masking fluid. So you'll just want to grab an eraser and gently rub it over the spots until it starts to peel off. Now, if your paper is still wet, you'll have some trouble getting this off without removing the paint. So if that happens, just let it dry for a little bit longer. Switch to this smaller one. Okay, so once you've got everything erased, we're going to grab our Burnt Umber, and we want a light mixture, so mostly water, a little bit of paint, and we're just going to fill in these spaces. You can see here, they're not perfectly white. On this one, they're lighter, but they're still not completely white. So we're just going to add a little bit of light brown in the spots. this is optional, but once you've got your spaces filled in, you can darken the areas around the spots. So I'm just going to grab some of the Madder Lake and mix it with the Burnt Umber. And using just the tip of my brush, going around some of these spots. If your paper's still wet from when we were adding the brown, it will bleed a little bit into the spots. So you might have to give it a minute. And you don't have to do all of them. So the last thing I'm going to do is just add some spots of burnt umber down here. And maybe a little bit up here. Okay, and we are done. If you have any questions, you can drop me an email or leave a comment on Facebook, and I will get back to you. I hope you had fun painting. Keep an eye on our schedule for more crafts and painting projects in the future.